We're here tonight to talk about activism and hearing the voices that are so routinely silenced in our community. So I think it's imperative that right now we recognise that our conversation is happening on stolen land. I want to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present, to Gary Foley and Amelia Telford who are on our panel, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here tonight. So thank you for joining us at the Wheeler Centre for tonight's panel, What's That Sound? Activism Today. My name's Tess Lawley. I'm a community radio host and a rather endlessly passionate advocate for women, young people, and the voices that are so often excluded from media and society. I think it's pretty fair to say that this week has been a disappointing one for progressive thinkers. Slight understatement, I know. The world's most powerful nation has elected a president based on a selection of hateful and harmful beliefs, and none of us really know what the next 4 years is going to hold. But one thing is very certain: there will always be activism, there will always be advocacy, and there will always be something worth fighting for. So tonight our panellists will each speak on a topic of their choice for 10 minutes. I can't say I totally envy you guys. It's not exactly easy to fit, human rights or marriage equality into 10 minutes, so good luck. And luckily we'll have a panel discussion and an audience Q&A to follow. So please make sure your phone is on silent. Though feel free to tweet up a storm, whether that's because of your constructive rage or your unbridled admiration for our panel. I myself have been preparing for a little bit of both. And join me in welcoming our panellists tonight. Jim Obergefell is a civil rights activist who embraced his newfound role after the US Supreme Court made marriage equality the law of the land on June 26, 2015. Former Cincinnati realtor, he has worked with organisations such as the Human Rights Campaign and Equality Ohio, and has been honoured with awards from organisations such as Services and Advocacy for Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual and Transgender Elders, Equality Florida, Equality North Carolina, the ACLU of Southern California, Cleveland Stonewall Democrats, the International Court Council, the National Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce, and the Ohio Democratic Party. Not exactly a short list of admirers, so please welcome Jim. Elaine Pearson is the Australian Director at Human Rights Watch. Based in Sydney, she works to influence Australian foreign and domestic policies in order to give them a human rights dimension. Elaine regularly briefs journalists, politicians and government officials, appears on television and radio programs, testifies before parliamentary committees and speaks at public events. Elaine also writes frequently for publications including Harper's Bazaar, The Guardian, Wall Street Journal, and she is an adjunct lecturer in law at the University of New South Wales. From 2007 to 2012, she was the Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch's Asia Division. Please make Elaine welcome. Amelia Telford, a young Aboriginal and South Sea Islander woman from Bundjalung country, is the National Director for the Seed Indigenous Youth Climate Network. Alongside the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, fantastic organisation, Amelia supports Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people building a movement for climate justice. Amelia was awarded the National NAIDOC Youth of the Year Award in 2014 for her commitment to building a more just and sustainable future for all young people. Welcome, Amelia. And our final panellist is Gary Foley. Gary is an Australian Aboriginal Gumbaynggirr activist, academic, writer and actor. He is best known for his role in establishing the Aboriginal Tent Embassy in Canberra in 1972 and for establishing an Aboriginal legal service in Redfern in the 1970s. He's currently a Professor of History at Victoria University. Welcome, Gary. Thank you so much for welcoming our panellists tonight. First of all, we'll be hearing from Jim, and I'll be back with you after these guys have spoken to have a bit of a panel discussion and an audience Q&A as well. Thanks very much. Jim.
Thank you, Tess. So first, let me just say I'm sorry on behalf of the rational Americans, I'm so sorry that we've done what we have. So activism. I've called myself an accidental activist for quite some time. And the reason I called myself that is it was a series of events that I could have never planned for, never expected, never thought would happen that led me to this place. And I'm an accidental activist because of love. It all started when I fell in love with a man named John. And I fell in love with him the third time we met. And we built a life together in Cincinnati, Ohio. And life changed for us in 2011 when I noticed when John was walking, it sounded different. His left foot seemed to slap the floor harder than his right foot. And that led to a series of doctor's appointments, medical tests, specialist visits, and he was diagnosed with motor neuron disease, ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. And as you can imagine, that turned our world upside down, because here was the man I loved more than anything in the world, who was given a death sentence. With motor neuron disease, typically within 2 to 5 years, the person dies. And I had committed myself to him. We had never had the ability to marry. That wasn't possible in the state of Ohio. And we had talked about going to other states to marry, but we only wanted to marry when it actually would carry legal weight. We did not want to do it just to have it be a symbolic ceremony. So we never did marry, but we made those commitments to one another. And one of those commitments was that no matter what, I would care for him as long as possible. So when he was diagnosed with ALS, for me, the only thing I could imagine doing was staying by his side and caring for him no matter what happened. He was diagnosed in 2011, and by mid-2013, he was bedridden and in at-home hospice care. And I was his full-time caregiver. And it was scary, it was tiring, it was overwhelming. But again, this was the man I loved, the person I'd promised to care for no matter what. And for me, being the one to care for him every day, 24 hours a day, it was an honor, it was a privilege. The next thing that happened that took me on my path to be an accidental activist, John was diagnosed with ALS, but then in June of 2013, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled in the Windsor case, and that ruling struck down part of the Defense of Marriage Act. And that meant that finally the federal government would have to acknowledge and recognize same-sex marriages that were performed in states where they were allowed. And in a moment of spontaneous love and joy, when that ruling came out, I proposed to John. I asked him to marry me. Now, of course, John was bedridden, and it wasn't an easy thing for us to do to actually get married. We had to go to another state. But how do you get someone who is bedridden and nearing the end of his life to another state in order to do that? Well, for us, that meant we had to charter a medical jet and fly to the state of Maryland. But we did that because it was important to us to actually make those promises and commitments public and legal. And we wanted to be able to say, husband. It was very important to us. So we flew to Maryland in a medical jet, and we parked on the tarmac of the Baltimore airport. We never left the jet, and we got to say those words we never expected to. I do. And it was the happiest moment of our lives. And a lot of people would say, well, why is marriage so important? Can't you just, your partners, civil partnership, civil union? Marriage is something vastly different than a civil union, a simple partnership. It's one of the oldest institutions of humanity, and we simply wanted the ability to participate in that and be able to say husband and have it mean something. And we had that opportunity, and it was seriously the happiest moment of my life. And when we made those vows, we had no plans to do anything else. We simply wanted to live out John's remaining days as husband and husband. 2 days after we got married, there was a story about us in our local newspaper. And it was the story about how we had to jump through all of these hoops just to get married, just to do something millions of other people took for granted. And because that story was in our local newspaper, it came up in conversation. Friends of ours went to a party, and they ran into a civil rights attorney. They brought up our story. And that civil rights attorney asked them if they thought we might be willing to talk to him. We met him 5 days after we got married. And in that conversation, Al, the civil rights attorney, did something that broke our hearts but made us angry. He pulled out a blank death certificate and said, "Do you guys understand that when John dies, his last official record as a person will be wrong? Ohio will say he's unmarried, and Jim, your name won't be there as his surviving spouse." Well, he was right. That was something we hadn't thought about. We knew the state of Ohio wouldn't acknowledge our marriage because the state of Ohio, the people of Ohio, had passed a constitutional amendment banning same-sex marriage. We knew that, but that was an abstract concept. When he told us this, it broke our hearts, and it made us angry. So when Al, our eventual attorney, asked if we wanted to do something to change it, to make it better, we talked about it, and we decided that yes, we did. We wanted to fight for each other, we wanted to fight for our marriage, and we wanted to do something for people like us. So we filed suit against the state of Ohio and the city of Cincinnati. 11 days after we got married, I was in federal court in Cincinnati. And I got to take the stand and talk to this judge and explain to the judge what my marriage meant to me, what it meant to John, and how much it hurt to have the state we called home pretend we didn't exist. And that was what we were fighting for. We wanted to be recognized. We wanted dignity. We wanted respect. And that day, that judge ruled in our favor. And he ruled that the state of Ohio had to recognize our marriage on John's death certificate when he died. And he died 3 months later. But he died knowing that he had done what he could to live up to his promise to love, honor, and protect me. And when he died, he knew our marriage would be recognized on his death certificate. Within a few months, our case was joined by other cases from Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Michigan, 4 states. And there were a total of 8 cases that were fighting for the right to marry and the right to have those lawful marriages recognized by our states. And we did it for love. We simply wanted to fight for our loved ones, for our spouses, for our partners, for our children. And that's what we wanted, simply to be treated the same as every other American. Our cases went to an appeals court which ruled against us. And it was heartbreaking and painful. But because this appeals court ruled against us, it meant that now, perhaps, the Supreme Court would accept our case and rule on marriage equality for good. And that's exactly what happened. In June of 2016, June 26, 2015, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled in Obergefell v. Hodges that the Constitution required that states issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples and recognize lawful same-sex marriages that were performed in other states. And it was one of the most beautiful moments of my life, because for once in my life as an out gay man, I felt like an equal American. And the joy that was evident across our country was amazing. And I realized over that 2-year process of our case that one of the things that made a difference is that we told our story. We told our story, and the other 30 plaintiffs in the consolidated case told their stories. And stories matter. Stories can touch hearts and minds, and they can change opinions. And I experienced that even in my own circle of friends. I was told by a couple people that I've known for years that knowing me, having met John, and watching my fight, our fight for marriage equality, changed their opinion on that issue. So stories do matter. They really do change hearts and minds. We thought there would be backlash. And unfortunately, there's been pretty serious backlash. And part of that backlash is evident in the election of Donald Trump as our president. And I think with any step forward in activism, any step forward in civil rights, rights for any group of people, you have a step forward, oftentimes other people try to push you back. And that's what we're seeing in the United States. The right for marriage isn't safe. And that scares me. It scares me to go back to the United States later this week and to go back into an environment where suddenly hatred and bigotry that had been hidden and pushed down is now at the forefront. The horrible treatment of people that's happening since this election is frightening. And for me, as an accidental activist, I am now a purposeful activist. And I have to keep fighting. And my fight has grown from being focused on LGBTQ rights to the rights of every single person. Because until every person can grow up, can live in a world where they are able to be their authentic self and live freely and safely and happily, there's work to do. And for me, knowing that the pushback and the hatred that I'm experiencing and seeing in the United States, as well as other places around the world, the one thing that gives me hope is the younger generation. Over and over, the younger generation in the United States, when marriage equality would come up, they would say, well, of course you should be able to get married, and of course you should have those non-discrimination protections. So the younger generation gives me hope, and I wish that we did not have to fight the battle that we are currently fighting. So for me, as someone who came to this fight, to the civil rights fight as an accidental activist, I am now a purposeful activist, and I'm in it for the long term. I started out because I needed to live up to my promises and commitments to my husband. And now my promises and commitments are to every single person, every single American and beyond, because we all share one thing and one thing in common. We are all human beings. We all deserve life, we all deserve happiness, we all deserve the ability to live our lives without fear. And until that happens, we all have work to do. So for me, activism means using my voice, using my energy to speak up for those who can't speak for themselves, and to keep fighting to make sure that we move forward, not backwards. And I did it all for love. And I'm really grateful and humbled that the love that I had from John and our 21-year relationship led me to a place where I can now fight for others. It's the greatest gift of my life that I can fight for John, that I helped create a legacy in his honor and in his name. And I'm happy to keep fighting for the rest of my life. I've given up on everything else I've ever done. I'm now an activist for good. So I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm thrilled to add my voice to the fight for marriage equality in Australia. And I have learned, and I've mentioned this already, stories matter. I will tell you, I was in Ireland recently, and I heard the same thing there. In their fight for marriage equality, when they would go out into rural Ireland expecting pushback and people to say, no, we are not in favor of marriage equality, what they found is that people said, well, of course I'm in favor of marriage equality, because their children, their grandchildren, their friends told them stories. They got to know people. And what was an abstract concept of marriage equality became real. And they understood the stories and the lives behind it. And for me, that was my experience as the plaintiff in marriage equality in the United States. People got to know my story, got to know John's and my story, and what was abstract became real. And that's how we change things for the better. Telling stories and letting people know us. So thank you very much for having me here, and I'm looking forward for the rest of the evening. So thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Jim, for sharing that story. I'm Elaine Pearson. I'm the Australia Director at Human Rights Watch, and I'm going to speak tonight about an area closer to home. I'm going to talk a bit about activism in the world of refugee rights here in Australia and talk about some of the challenges and successes that we've had, because it's still very much a work in progress, as you'll all know. I also want to talk a little bit about the power of images and photographs in campaigns, and how those stories can be really crucial tools in connecting with people and in shaping public opinion. So here in Australia, I think we've seen over the last decade or so, but particularly over the last 3 years, since Kevin Rudd reintroduced mandatory offshore processing for anyone coming by boat, we've really seen an uphill battle for refugee advocates working in the space. It's been increasingly difficult to hold our government to account under international law. And sometimes it just feels like our efforts haven't really been that successful, because right now, if you look at Manus and Nauru, we still have about 2,000 people who are languishing in limbo 3 years after we started sending people there. Our role at Human Rights Watch has been really to investigate those abuses and expose those abuses that are happening on Manus and Nauru. So I myself visited Manus last year. My colleague Mike went to Nauru a few months ago, and the work that we did together with other organisations like the Human Rights Law Centre, like Amnesty International, we gathered first-hand testimonies from victims, from witnesses, from refugees about their experiences, and we tried to share their stories in order to share the human cost of these policies. And it's really, you know, I think part of the reason why Australia adopted this policy of sending people to remote offshore locations, part of why Australia made it so difficult for journalists to go to these places is because then it's very difficult for us to verify exactly what is taking place. And in those types of environments, it's very easy for abusers to thrive. They thrive in the dark, in the secret, where no one knows. And the sort of tried methodology of Human Rights Watch for many years has been to name and shame governments, so to try and shine the spotlight on those abuses, because we believe that when those abuses are exposed, it can help put pressure on governments to change. Well, the naming and shaming methodology hasn't worked so well when it comes to Australia and the refugee policy. And that's because the Australian government's actually quite proud of the abuses. I mean, Australia is actually, the abuses are an essential part of deterring boat migration. So that sort of made us really rethink our traditional methodology and what are some of the other ways that we can go about chipping around the edges of this policy. And so we've talked to other organisations that we work with in this space, and if I think about what has been sort of a real changing groundswell movement in the refugee space over the last few years, it would be what I would call the Baby Asher moment. So all of you may remember Baby Asher. The photos of Baby Asher emerged on social media, a smiling, beautiful 12-month-old baby. And this baby was born in Australia, but in danger of being sent back to Nauru together with her family to live in a tent, which is indeed where the abuse happened and where, you know, she was hospitalised and then initially brought to Australia. And I think, you know, it's a bit like what Jim was saying about the power of stories. I think everyone could relate to this baby, and this baby really became a symbol of an innocent victim of Australia's, you know, political games on refugees. And what was successful about that campaign was, you know, we saw at Brisbane Hospital, when the government was about to deport Baby Asher and her family, you had doctors, nurses, healthcare workers, you had church groups, you had unions, all coming together to prevent that deportation. And the government couldn't just dismiss this as, you know, the work of activists, the work of refugee lawyers, but the government actually was forced to come to the table. And this was a small but very significant victory because that family wasn't deported. In fact, they remain living in the community here in Australia, although their long-term future certainly is not secure. So I think it's really important that we sort of capitalise and that we learn from these moments and how we can replicate them. I think one of the challenges that we really face working in the refugee space here in Australia is particularly looking at how the government and politicians have tried to make activism a bit like a dirty word. So if you're an activist, you're seen as partisan, you're left-wing. So they've tried to sort of neutralise, I guess, the work that we do in exposing facts by saying that, you know, this is politically motivated. The other thing that the government has really done more recently is they've tried to blame activists for some of the abuses that are taking place. So you might remember when there were reports of self-harm or indeed that horrible case where a refugee set himself on fire and died in Nauru earlier this year. One of the responses from our immigration minister was to say, this is the fault of activists because you're giving refugees false hope by calling on the government to address this situation. So, you know, the government has a very sort of clear propaganda campaign to try and dismiss and discredit the work of activists. But I would say what has happened in the last couple of days on refugee policy in Australia is actually a win for activists. So you may have seen the announcement yesterday that the US government is now going to resettle some of the refugees from Manus and Nauru. And look, this is far too early to say it's a champagne moment, but clearly if that happens, that will be a victory for some of the refugees on Manus and Nauru, and it's an important starting point. But I think it's also a victory for activists because it shows that all of our work in exposing the horrors of what happens on Nauru and on Manus is working, because it's basically the government admitting this is not a long-term solution for people. We recognise that we need to send people to other places in order to move on with their lives. So I think, you know, we don't have a lot of wins in this space, and clearly we're not there yet, but I think that refugee activists should feel quite encouraged by this movement in the past few days. I also just wanted to say a few words, I guess a bit more about how we have these moments and these images and these stories that can be quite powerful at a global level. And here I'm thinking of the image of the Syrian boy, Aylan Kurdi, who was the 3-year-old boy who washed up on a shore on a Turkish beach. And you may remember there was a horrible image of him which circulated on social media, face down in the waves. And I think it was a heartbreaking image. It was difficult for people to see. My colleague, Peter Bukart, is our emergencies director. He was one of the people working on the front lines of Europe in the refugee crisis at that time. And he told me, you know, I thought long and hard really before I tweeted that image, because I knew that it would offend some people to tweet an image of a dead child. But I also felt like I needed to do something. I felt like the people of Europe needed to wake up. And this is the human cost. This is the reality of the EU's intransigence over refugee policy. And there, I mean, I think you really saw the power of social media. Traditional media initially was a bit scared to share the photo. I think they were scared of offending their readers, that it would be too confronting. But the image still managed to circulate, you know, around the world globally. And this had a huge impact. I mean, it had an impact here in Australia, where you had a Liberal MP, Craig Laundy, admit that he and his family were so upset about that image that he lobbied then the government to increase the number of resettlement places here in Australia. And we got an increased intake of Syrians as a result. That didn't just happen in Australia, it happened in Canada, it happened in Germany, where Merkel basically opened the door to hundreds of thousands of asylum seekers at an important time in need. So I think, you know, we can learn from these experiences and how to sort of capitalise and shape these stories. And I guess I just want to say that, you know, now we are living in these really uncertain times, in this sort of post-Brexit, post-Trump victory world. And with that uncertainty, there's, you know, people are scared about the future. And I think, you know, in those times, activism is even more important. But it's not just about preaching to the converted and just simply sort of doing what we've always done. I think we need to really think outside the box and think about how we can build people and move people from a position of apathy to one of compassion. And we have, you know, various practical examples of how that has worked, but I think there's, you know, clearly a lot more work to be done. So I'll probably leave it there, but just wanted to say, you know, thank you very much for your time tonight.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging country, in particular, pay respects to the land of the Kulin Nations, and here in Melbourne, pay respects to the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people, whose land on which we're gathered on. As a young Aboriginal woman myself, I think it's incredibly important to acknowledge the ongoing struggle of our people that we've been facing ever since colonisation, and that First Nations people and people of colour have been facing right around the world. But not only acknowledge the struggle, but also the resiliency of our people as, you know, one of the oldest surviving cultures in history, and to have survived, you know, the ongoing hatred and genocide and, you know, kind of fight to rule out our people. And so in a world today where, you know, more and more people are starting to face similar challenges, I think it's always important to acknowledge those who are on the front lines and have been on the front lines for an incredibly long time, and have been fighting and aren't going to give up anytime soon. So, yeah, I guess, you know, talking about activism, I think even some of the conversations that have already started, my brain is starting to tick and, you know, try and process things and put them into words. But you know, you can call me an activist, you can call me an environmentalist, but to me and many of the other young people that I work with through the SEED Indigenous Youth Climate Network, we're Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people who are fighting for, you know, to fulfil our cultural responsibility, to look after country, our land, and to look after each other. Because everything that I know about my culture goes back to exactly that, looking after our land and looking after each other. And so, yeah, tonight, sorry, I feel a little bit flustered because I think I've started to think about what's already been said and think about, you know, the challenges that we are facing, but want to acknowledge that, you know, it is Indigenous people and people of colour who are on the front lines. And so when it comes to climate change, it's our people, even though, you know, this might not be something that too many people know, it's our people that are on the front lines of not only the causes, so the digging up and the destruction of our land, but also the impacts. So whether it's rising sea levels in the Torres Strait, droughts, bushfires, heat waves, it's our communities that already face incredibly complex, severe challenges in our day-to-day lives. And so when hit by, you know, extreme weather events, it's harder and harder to actually, you know, respond and to sorry, I'm not sure why I'm feeling so flustered, but I guess I have one of the best jobs in the world. I'm the National Co-Director of the SEED Indigenous Youth Climate Network, and so I work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people right across the country who are passionate about protecting our land, our culture and our communities from fossil fuel extraction, so mainly from coal, gas and oil, and trying to build a more just and sustainable future by transitioning the you know, energy revolution that's happening right around the world. And so, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people, we make up the majority of our population, and we are the ones that, you know, are already being impacted by decisions that we haven't even been a part of. So we are trying to, you know, mobilise our young people, learn from the lessons of our elders and our old people, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from you, Uncle Gary. And you know, I guess in a world today where, you know, as we've already heard, we have seen and had a lot of announcements in the last week, it's hard to see the positive side of things. But when doing the work that I do with young people, what, you know, I feel incredibly lucky to have is hope, and to be surrounded by young people who give me so much hope every single day. And so I'd like to hand it over to a video for you to hear from some of the young people that I work with and to hopefully give you hope.
Climate change is affecting rural communities with an increased severe weather events.
Due to global warming and the melting of the polar ice caps, there are high-level sea rise in the Torres Strait.
We've just seen the largest coral bleaching event in the history of the Great Barrier Reef.
Fires are burning when they aren't meant to.
The calendar, we can't go off it anymore. It's just a useless to us now because we have to freestyle hunt and gather and get our native foods.
It worries me a lot to think about the world that my baby's going to inherit. I worry about her identity as an Aboriginal person with all the destruction to our land and our culture.
Australia is one of the world's largest exporters of fossil fuels, and regardless of where you send the coal and gas to be burnt, it still contributes to dangerous levels of global warming.
My name is Marwa Johnson. I'm a worthy woman from Central Queensland. I'm a part of the Wangan and Jagalingou people. The Adani Carmichael mine is proposed on the western side of our country to be one of the largest open-cut coal mines in the world, smack bang on top of the river.
Hello, my name is Gadrian Husam. I come from the Gulf of Carpentaria in a small town called Borlula. They want to frack that country right through, and we're going to get affected by it. if they're going to drill all around that, all our riverbeds going to be contaminated, because we all heard about the fracking already. We know about it. We've been experiencing it already from Queensland and across America, and all that gas going to come up underground and get into our riverbeds underneath and come up to our drinking water, turn our tap on, we're going to have flame on our taps.
My name is Conrad Rory. I'm from Borroloola, which is in the Northern Territory. My message to you guys is don't say yes to fracking, because it's really bad for your country, bad for your health, and it's bad for the environment.
Because we know how important it is to stand up and protect country. As young people, we're going to go out into our communities, we're going to connect our communities up on our issues that are happening. We're going to work together, and we're going to build a movement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are going to stand up for country.
We're here for one reason, and that's to protect our country. It maybe have one meaning, protect country, but that word country, it's got everything behind it. And that is what means a lot to us. That's our culture, our food is on our land, our water is on our land, and the songs that we keep in our heart and in our minds when we've been taught is what represent our country.
Who better to stand in solidarity with other mob than us, young blackfellas? We are the people that we have been waiting for.
I'm saying no to Adani, I'm saying no to climate change, I'm saying no to losing my culture.
We don't want mining industries within our communities or around our communities. If the land is poisoned, and so are we.
We want climate justice now. We don't want to keep wrecking our country. They want a voice, let's give them a voice. Let's scream it out loud here and now.
My name is Nayuka Gori. I'm a Gunai Kurnai, Gunditjmara, Wiradjuri and Yorta Yorta woman. I'm going to do whatever it takes to protect my country.
Stand together with thousands of people all across the country and take action with us at protectcountry.org.au.
Yeah, so I guess as I was trying to say, you know, as young people, we are a part of the oldest surviving culture in the world, and Indigenous people here in Australia and right around the globe have been looking after our land sustainably for generations. And so in a modern context, this is the way that we are trying to look after our land. And it's devastating that it comes down to, you know, actually, you know, stopping big oil, coal, gas companies from coming in and exploiting our communities and digging up, you know, our sacred country and our culture, you know, all for a little bit of money. And, you know, I guess it's the systems in society that have got us here. And I think my lessons in my activism so far, and it's not very long in comparison to some of our other panellists, in particular Uncle Gary, but I guess some of my lessons is that, you know, we need to approach social movements and build the power of the people in a way that doesn't perpetuate the same systems that have got us here. And so, you know, we need to work together in a way that values people equally, but also acknowledges those that have been on the front lines, that, you know, face, I guess, the racism, the sexism, you know, whatever it is, more so than others. We can't go forth in an extractive way where we take and take and take without giving back, and have, you know, mutually beneficial, strong relationships with each other in order to work together to confront these challenges. And in particular, I think, you know, as a young Aboriginal woman, I think we do need to value and look at the importance and strength of our women who have been the backbones of our communities, and you know, acknowledge the way that we treat women is reflected in the way that we treat our Mother Earth, who provides for us, and who, you know, Mother Earth can survive without humans, but we can't survive without her. And so the other lesson that I've learned is that we can't wait. You know, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we have been, you know, promised a lot from different governments, and we have been promised a lot from, you know, our own people who, you know, who say that they are with us sometimes. And it's not enough to kind of wait for others to take a stand and for others to follow through with this. We actually have to look at what our own role is, and get out there and start doing it. And, you know, if we can show leadership and actually start building the solutions ourselves, solutions that don't exploit our values of looking after each other and looking after the land, then we have to leave everyone else with no choice but to follow. And so I think that goes with, the stories and the stories that we tell ourselves, and looking at the resiliency, looking at, the stories that give us hope and inspire us, and try and not get too caught up in the hatred, because it's, by looking at the stories of communities that are already out there leading, a solar farm in their community, or I can't think of another example right now, but actually look at the stories of people out there who are already doing this and just get on with the job, because climate change is already and will continue to impact the way that we live, where we live, and unfortunately, if we live, as do so many of the other issues that we face. And so I think, I hope that you all go away from tonight thinking about what your role is in particular in terms of supporting these different issues, and not waiting one other moment for you. And I don't say this to criticise you, Jim, but not waiting for your accidental activist moment, but knowing that there are people who have no choice but are born into this fight, who are born political, like myself and like so many other Indigenous people, and actually knowing that, you can't wait for this issue to reach your doorstep. You have to act now, because as people throughout history have said, an injustice of one person is an injustice for all people. And so I put that challenge out to you, to fight in whatever way you can, in whatever role you're able to. So thank you so much.
I pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land, of this particular land that I stand on tonight. They have tolerated me being in their midst for over 45 years, and I thank them for that. Brother Jim here, his accidental activism was born out of love. My initially accidental activism was born out of a bit of both, love and hate and love. I've said for the last almost 50 years, that what made me a political activist was firstly a really good kicking that I got from a bunch of fascist thugs who were at the time known as the New South Wales Constabulary, or to be more precise, a particular branch of the New South Wales Constabulary, the notorious 21 Division, a notorious paramilitary police outfit that came out of the 1930s to deal with a bunch of criminals in a suburb called Darlinghurst, the Darlinghurst Razor Gangs, but somehow or other was never disbanded. A particular squad that produced, amongst other New South Wales police luminaries, as Roger Rogerson, who these days is very deservedly where he belongs. But the 21 Division was sent into a place called Redfern, and against young people like myself. I was 17 years old. Like numerous young Aboriginal people in Redfern in the late 60s, I had come from the bush, from north coast of New South Wales, after being thrown out of school. But that's another story. I'm not going to tell you that tonight. But I arrived in Sydney, naive, innocent. But like I say, I had that innocence kicked out of me one night in the Regent Street Police Station by a couple of thugs from the 21 Division. And the thing that really got under my skin that night, and really made me angry and put a fire in my belly was the fact that the thing they were kicking me for, I hadn't done. And that really got under my skin. A week later, a man by the name of Paul Coe, who I had met, who like me had come to Redfern from the bush. We were both living in a place called Redfern at a time when the Redfern Aboriginal community, when I first arrived there in 1966 in Sydney, there were about 1,500 Aboriginal people in a big white city. The White Australia policy was still well and truly in force. And so we, 1,500 Aboriginal people in Redfern represented a fairly big community. But within 2 years, as a result of certain political things that had occurred at the time, the New South Wales apartheid system was closed down, and suddenly there was this massive exodus from the rural areas by Aboriginal people into the inner city of Sydney, so that Redfern grew into a community that was close to 35,000 people, biggest Aboriginal community that's ever existed in the history of Australia. And the one thing we all had in common, we were all impoverished. We were impoverished, landless refugees in our own country. And the other thing we all had in common, that we were subject to an intense campaign for reasons known only to themselves on the part of the New South Wales Police to brutalise and intimidate us. And that's how come I got a kicking from the coppers. But a week later, a man by the name of Paul Coe from southern New South Wales come to me and he said to me he was interested in forming a little group of young people because we'd lost faith in the older generation's tactics and strategies to counter the experience we were having on the streets of Redfern at the hands of the police. And he said he was forming a little group of young people, a discussion group. And I said, what are you going to discuss? He said, we're going to discuss what we might be able to do about the police harassment that's going on in our community. He didn't need to ask me twice. I was with him. I said, I'm with you, brother. And then he handed me a book. And he said, well, if you're with us, read this. This is what we're going to discuss in our first meeting. And the book was a book that I've never forgotten to this day. And this is where the love element comes in. I loved this man who wrote this book. By the time I read it, he was dead. He'd been murdered. He'd been murdered because he, in the long term, refused to be the racist they wanted him to be, and that man was Malcolm X. And the autobiography of Malcolm X and the kicking by the coppers in New South Wales gave me the fire in my belly that lasted me for a long, long time in my life. I can't necessarily say I'm still the same sort of bloke I was when I was 17, because I'm standing before you tonight as a 66-year-old diabetic with emphysema who resides largely in the ivory tower of academia, being a history professor. But being a history professor, I also endorse the last elements of what Jim said, in that stories are important and stories can change people's lives. And I strongly endorse that because as a historian, that's what I do. I tell stories. I tell stories to young students who have got, when they come to me with absolutely no knowledge of their own history as Australians and as freshly arrived Australians. But having spent a semester in my class, they go away changed people. Changed people not only in terms of their understanding of what has happened to Aboriginal people in Australia, but what has happened to them as Australians and the ignorance that has been imposed upon them, and ignorance that they're determined to overcome and ensure that their children will not be the same. So, storytelling is important. It can change lives. When I became a political activist in Redfern when I was in my late teens, we found ways to sort out the coppers. And in doing so, we created the first free shopfront legal aid centre in Australia. We introduced the concept of free legal aid into the Australian context. Of course, a lot of young people these days wouldn't understand what that is because it's a long gone concept. really, in terms of universal free legal aid for the poor, which is what Gough Whitlam introduced after looking at our example when he became Prime Minister. That was removed 10 years later by another Labor government who did a lot of evil things to you and I, but we won't go into that tonight, folks. The important thing about the political activism that I was involved in Redfern, when I consider myself to have been a political activist, there were several important aspects to that. First and foremost, we didn't function as individuals, you know, and I reject the notion that, you know, Gary Foley is an important political activist of that era. I was a member of a collective of really extraordinary young people. We were all young. We all taught ourselves. I mean, we were self-taught. We educated ourselves politically. And we learnt from brutal experience on the tough, mean streets of Redfern, you know, fighting coppers, but eventually developing ideas and ways of getting around that. And always at the root of what we were doing was we were developing basic ideas about what was important to us as an Aboriginal community. Not to us as an Aboriginal individual or an elite group of Aboriginal people, a managerial or entrepreneurial elite that some people in the Aboriginal community advocate these days. We were drawing on our collective knowledge and experience, and we were seeking ideas that could ensure that in the long term Aboriginal people were able to regain control over their own lives. Self-determination was the key issue for us, because when I was 17, Aboriginal people had been denied that in New South Wales for all of the 20th century. You know, under the old apartheid system in New South Wales that lasted till 1967, Aboriginal people were denied the fundamental right to determine their own destiny. And so what we were about was developing ideas and drawing from examples wherever we could find them. We looked not only within Australia, but beyond, in the same way as my great-grandfather had been part of the first modern-day Aboriginal political organisation, the Australian Aboriginal Progressive Association, in 1924. The first modern-day Aboriginal political organisation was set up when a group of people, including my great-grandfather, adopted and adapted some of the ideas of a man called Marcus Garvey, the father of international black nationalism, and developed those ideas into an Australian context and developed that first modern-day Aboriginal political organisation. Most of you don't know that because, for the simple reason, you've been deliberately non-educated about the real history of Aboriginal Australia. People would rather teach you and your children still, the kids who come into my class at fresh out of high school at Victoria University, are coming into my class knowing nothing about the real history. What little Indigenous education they may have got, if they got any at all, usually involved something about dot paint, a few didgeridoos and a couple of dances. Nothing of substance about the Aboriginal resistance that was so active throughout the 20th century. And you know, most of the adults in this room don't even know that, which is a great tragedy, and which is what I'm trying to address these days. I see my role these days not so much as an activist, but as somebody who's trying to enlighten both people of my generation, but most especially the next generation, because, you know, tomorrow belongs to them. Every dog has his day, and I've had mine a long time ago, folks. My day is over. And I know that because, as I said, I was part of a collective. And one of the really sad things for me tonight, to stand up here tonight, one of the sad things for me is that virtually all of the people who were part of that original collective in 1972, who went on to create the Aboriginal Embassy, which in 1972 changed the course of Australian history, virtually everybody who was involved in that action, we were all around about 19, 20 years old when we did that. We changed the course of Australian history. We helped to bring down 23 years of Conservative government. You know, the McMahon government went down the drain, in part, significant part, because of us. That's what Gough Whitlam always said. And yet, the majority, 90% of those young people who stood with me and fought the coppers at the Aboriginal Embassy, you know, bravely stood their ground when the coppers moved in to smash us, and smash us they did. But 90% of the people who were there with me are no longer with us now, which in part is an illustration, an example of the extent to which Aboriginal people, the life expectancy of Aboriginal people is still considerably less than that of ordinary Australians. Look at me, folks. You know, even though I am a diabetic, emphysemic, 66-year-old Aboriginal man, by being alive, I'm a rarity. I should be in a museum. I was in a museum. I should be in a museum because 80% of Aboriginal men my age, only 66, in this state are dead. 80%, more than 80% of non-Aboriginal men my age in this state, the best state in Australia for an Aboriginal person to live, are alive, you know? And so it makes me sad that many of those staunch, solid activists who stood with us in 1972 at the Aboriginal Embassy weren't here tonight, sitting down there with me, listening to my sister talk like she does. It gives me hope for the future, knowing that there's a generation following us who aren't necessarily listening to the likes of me and my generation, because my generation rejected the tactics and strategies of the generation who came before us. We had respect for them, but we rejected their tactics and strategies because we didn't believe that they would be effective. We sought our own understanding. We sought our own direction. We developed our own tactics and strategies, as does need the young people of today who are following us. They need to do that. They shouldn't listen to us. They need to develop, and as you can see in that video, folks, that made me really proud tonight. I know that Tony Birch, who works with me at Victoria University, he's the one who alerted me to this seed mob a while back. He's a great admirer of the work that they do, as am I, you know. I think it's fantastic what they're doing, and I'd strongly urge you all to follow and watch what they do and support them. You know, forget about the old codgers like me. I'll be dead soon, and everybody will be relieved and happy, and it'll be all over. And then you'll have to deal with Robbie Thorpe. But no, these mobby folks, I felt really proud tonight listening to this young woman. In her hesitancy in parts, reminded me of what I was like when I was young and standing up in front of an audience and trying to articulate what I felt, you know. And I know what it's like to have gone through that. I'm not like that anymore, but neither will she be like that for too long, because these seed mob are the ones who give the likes of me hope, and that's really all I can say, except I was very moved by the story of my brother Jim here tonight, and I feel really sad that he's probably going to have to go back to a place like the United States has become, but I'll resist saying anything about Trump. I think that I should point out here, despite the great gains, and this is probably a lesson for everybody in this, the great gains that the Aboriginal political movement made in the 1970s, and essentially right up until 1988, all were dispelled through what became known as the white backlash, you know, which ultimately led into Hansonism, the first version of Hansonism, which was kicked along by the history wars and the emergence of the new right in Australia, who get all offended when you call them what they really are. Some of them are racist, you know, they get all upset and get their feelings hurt and need to be reassured by vast articles in certain newspapers in Australia. And whilst I feel really sorry for them, it doesn't alter the fact that the momentum went out of the Aboriginal political movement probably post-1988. And I really like to think, and I think that I can see, the emergence of a new generation who are going to reignite the fires that were once burned by us. Although that's probably a bad analogy when it comes to talking about climate change and stuff. But to reignite the strength of the movement that existed in my early days and the momentum that was lost. I look to seed and the younger generation, including my son who's over in Europe somewhere, agitating against the British Museum. I don't know how far he's going to get with that. Probably as far as I got 10 years ago, which wasn't very far at all. But it's important that he's getting that experience, because I went to Europe a long, 40 years ago, and the experience held me in good stead for the rest of my life. And I hope my son does the same, and I know for certain that my sister here and her crew, the seed mob, are going to do some great stuff into the future too. I'm just sorry I won't be alive to see it, but I'll try and stay alive as long as I can so I can see some of it. Thank you.
As I was saying, I think a really clear theme that came through everything that's been said tonight is the idea of telling stories and how important that is. And as someone who works in media and dedicates a lot of her time to telling stories, I'm really thrilled. That's nice. But I wanted to know what the panel thinks on how and who we tell these stories to. Jim, did you want to start?
Well, for me, it's, you know, from my perspective in the United States, we have so many stories to tell to educate people. And I say that because after marriage equality, I heard across the country, well, so the fight for LGBTI rights is done because you can get married now. And that's so not true in the States because we don't have non-discrimination protection, so many other things. So for me, when I think about whom do we have to tell these stories to, it's every single person that we can. It's up to all of us to tell those stories, to share that information, because that's how we educate others and it's how we change their minds. So it's as many people as we can, but for me, one of the most important ones is our younger generations. They need to know what's come before so that they can take that knowledge and keep moving us forward. So younger generation, but really anyone who will listen.
Amelia is someone from the younger generation and someone who's been given quite the task tonight.
Thanks, Uncle Gary.
Who do you think we tell these stories to and how do we tell them?
I agree. I think I would say that it's everyone. I think it's also important to acknowledge how we tell the stories and thinking about not only the message that we're trying to convey, but the messenger as well. I think in my work, I have learned pretty quickly the importance of, you know, the right people telling the right story in the right way. So when it comes to climate change and, you know, us as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people talking about this issue in our communities, because, you know, a lot of our work in the last couple of years, Growing Seed, has been about actually raising awareness of the impacts of climate change on our communities, because when we're faced with so many urgent, pressing issues on our doorsteps every day, an abstract issue like climate change can seem quite far away and hard to grasp, however you want to say that. And so, you know, it hasn't been something that, you know, some of our people have learned in schools or, you know, even gone to school to learn about. And so we need to talk about it in a way that our people understand. And so we talk more about protecting country rather than saying, you know, protecting the land from the impacts of climate change, because, you know, it's the way that we tell it to the right audiences as well. And so that works best for us, but that's going to work completely different for another community. And so I think it's the stories that are important, but the way that we tell it and who tells it and how, and the importance of making sure that we tell stories through conversation and face-to-face and actually, you know, getting out there and having a yarn, but also, I guess, acknowledging the importance of stories on social media and the platforms that we now have tools to connect with people more easily across the country and around the world.
I think as a follow-on from that, talking about having that conversation and acknowledging that a lot of issues that you advocate for are not simply one perspective. There's a lot to consider, and I think that came across in both what you said, Gary and Elaine, where Elaine, you said that activism is made out to be a dirty word by, say, our government, and Gary, you spoke to the fact that the real history of Aboriginal resistance has been hidden in formal education. I wondered if you guys wanted to speak to how you overcome something as sort of daunting as formal systems really blocking out the stories that we want to tell.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the ways that we do that is through the power of social media. I mean, I think that's been one of the really wonderful things, is that we now have this platform where we can directly reach a whole bunch of people. And I mean, I think now globally, HRW, Human Rights Watch, has 3 million followers on Twitter. We have a lot on Facebook. You know, we're branching out into Instagram, Snapchat, you name it. But I think it's also, thinking about how we tell those stories. So, in the good old days, we would just write a very detailed, very factual human rights report that would be 100 pages. We'd send it to the government in question, we'd hope that they'd read it, and we'd initiate a discussion. But nowadays, that's just not as effective anymore. We still write those reports because they're really important to have that truth or that history presented there. But what's also equally important, I think, is now to have visual narratives and to have people telling their experiences. And what we're finding is that people are actually sharing those experiences much more widely on social media, and we can engage a whole different audience besides the ultimate advocacy target, which is the policymaker or the politician that we're trying to reach out to.
And I do want to come back to social media in just a moment, being in the age of collectivism. But Gary, did you want to speak to, is there a way to share the real Aboriginal history if it's not in our schools and through formal education?
I went to university very late in life, at almost the age of 50. But when I completed my first-class honours in history at Melbourne University, and my PhD, which won the Chancellor's Award at the University of Melbourne, I worked for about 5 years in the education faculty at Melbourne Uni as a lecturer, because I felt it was, I'd realised long before that when I was young I thought I could educate everyone in the world single-handedly. But, when you get a bit older and you realise a few home truths, you realise that's not going to be the case. And so I thought to myself, well, what's the next best thing? And I decided that if I could get through to just one teacher, then you're potentially getting through to 100,000 kids in that teacher's lifetime of teaching. And so Tony Birch and myself, I believe, taught a whole generation of really good young teachers at Melbourne Uni education faculty before I finally left Melbourne Uni. And I know that strategy at that time worked because some of those kids who were, just uni students, young uni students, when they were in my classes at Melbourne Uni, some of them are now the head of the history department in their local high school in various parts of around, both Melbourne and Victoria. And they occasionally get in touch with me and are very proud to tell me the great gains that they're able to make in the context of their little history department in their little high school, wherever it is, in implementing some of the ideas and some of the stuff that they learned from both myself and Tony Birch. So I believe that, there's a whole little army of teachers out there in Victoria and probably throughout Australia now who are passing on that message, and that's some small gain, but it's still not enough. When I was young, I had the great advantage of having learned some important communication lessons from some of the greatest Aboriginal communicators in the generation before me, and I'm talking particularly of Faith Bandler, the person who brought about the 67 referendum, conducted that fantastic 10-year campaign. John Newfong, the greatest Aboriginal communicator of all time, the first Aboriginal professional journalist in Australia, and one of the greatest speakers John was a legend. I learnt from them, and the first lesson I ever got in information technology was from Faith Bandler in the Federal Council for the Advancement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders office in Bathurst Street in Sydney, towards the arse end of the 1967 referendum campaign, when she taught me how to use, and the only people over 50 in this audience are going to know what I'm talking about now, she taught me how to use one of those hand-operated Gestetner machines, And that was my first lesson in information technology. You could use this and you could produce 50 pamphlets an hour or something, then you'd fold them up, stick them in an envelope, address the envelope and post them out, and that's how you got information out. Not long after that, there was an electric stencil machine. That was a gun piece of equipment. Then there was a fax machine. Then there was a telex machine. Not telex like you understand it these days, fax, a little bit more ancient than that, with a ticker tape. And each development in information technology, John Newfong had taught me the importance of staying up with the information technology, so that by the time I went to Melbourne Uni, I had already taught myself in the really early days of the internet, before it wasn't internet, just bulletin boards. I managed to download on a slow telephone line technical manuals, and I taught myself basic computer programming, so that by the time I got to Melbourne Uni at almost the age of 50, I not only studied history, every semester I did one subject in computer science, so that by the time I finished at Melbourne Uni, I had already created, which still exists today, the first Aboriginal owned and controlled website, a Koori history website on the internet. And that still today is the oldest Aboriginal owned, operated and put together Aboriginal website in the world. And I did everything on that. I wrote all the codes of the thing. Nobody else has ever put a finger to put in that website. Go and have a look at it. It's about 50,000 pages of it. And so that's why I'm a great believer in social media, which is the next stage of what I'm talking about, as an important, my son's in Germany, and he can talk to me every night. You know, when I was in Germany 40 years ago, it cost a fortune to ring up, and you can only talk for about 3 minutes or something, and even if you could ring up, otherwise it was a telegram or a letter. And so it's just extraordinary, the ability to communicate globally nowadays. That blows the mind of somebody like me. And I think that's one of the great advantages that the younger generation have got, the ability to instantly connect to almost anywhere on the planet. Well, not almost, anywhere on the planet, instantly. And that sort of ability to communicate has got to give the modern day activists a greater edge than we ever had in our day.
I think that's a really perfect point to pick up because, Jim, I wanted to get your thoughts particularly on the huge social media reaction that came with #LoveWins. What was that sort of like to witness that and to have that kind of communication? You spoke a little bit about the backlash and the negatives that came with your case, but what else was attached to that hashtag?
It was such an incredibly positive and a tidal wave of support across the country. You know, #LoveWins. It was everywhere. And it became this rallying cry for moving our country forward and for celebrating and embracing this progress in love and in rights. It was incredible. And when I think about social media, it's this wonderful ability to connect people and to build that community around something like LoveWins. But it's also something that gave people in the community a chance, kids or people in rural communities where they didn't know someone else who identifies as part of the LGBTI community. Social media gave them that community that they didn't have in reality. And that's a great thing that social media does. They could be themselves, and they could find people who supported and understood who they were. So social media for me has been such a great tool in moving our community forward. I really think that the change in attitudes in the States, well, I think pretty much everywhere, but from my perspective, the change in attitudes around equality and acceptance goes hand in hand with Facebook and other social media, because that gave everyone an outlet, an ability to build community, but also to expand awareness and start breaking down those abstract concepts and those preconceived notions that people had about a different community. They started to see them and get to know them as real people. And yeah, the LoveWins tidal wave, it was amazing just to see that. And I think about the day the decision came down, June 26th, and how Facebook turned red because there was this equal sign, a red and pink equal sign that took over Facebook. And so it was this great visual of support, and you really understood how happy the country was. And we wouldn't have had that obvious example of that without social media.
speaks to Elaine's point about visual representation as well. We will take, we have a short period to take questions from the audience, and we're really looking for a nice broad cross-section of voices in tonight's Q&A. So I'd like to specifically call for questions from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and also people of all genders tonight. So if you have a question, please put up your hand and we'll get a microphone to you.
Thank you so much. I can't believe that this talk is free. I feel like we're getting, you know, invaluable advice and history from you. I used to work for the architects that did the National Museum of Australia and also did the William Barak building just at the top of Swanston Street here. So I had the privilege of working with some people in the Wurundjeri community to consult for that, and I know that it's a controversial building amongst that community. So, and I don't want to speak for anyone on behalf of anyone about that. But there's different ways that we can do activism. Those architects put into the roof of our National Museum of Australia the image that Daniel Libeskind used in his Jewish museum in Berlin, which is the jagged star, which can only be seen from the roof, and that caused international sensation because he basically ripped off another architect, but that was completely on purpose to attract global attention to the fact that there was a genocide in this country, and that represented that in the same way that it represents the genocide of the Jewish people in Germany. So there are different ways of doing activism, and this morning I was an accidental activist because I also know that Daniel Grollo, who's the head of GrowCon, who did that building with a 32-storey Aboriginal elder's face, William Barak's face on the side of the building, he came out in the media this morning and said that he thinks we should be more respectful towards Donald Trump and his supporters. And that upset me so much they actually called the company and said, look, you can't do a building with an Aboriginal elder's face on it. Well, I mean, you can do that, but you can't also simultaneously say that Donald Trump should be paid respect. And I know my voice is shaking because I'm so upset about Donald Trump. I spend a lot of time on Twitter, and I'm a clicktivist, but I also think we can translate, if we think about our relationships and who we know. Like, I just made a phone call today because I happen to have this random personal connection with Daniel Grollo. So just if you can maybe talk to how we can link in with communities, think beyond what we think about being on the barricades, screaming and yelling, other ways of getting our point across to people randomly, like I did this morning.
Well, in terms of architects, when I got bashed by the coppers, I was an apprentice draftsman, and I had ideas about becoming an architect. But back in 1972, just prior to Gough Whitlam becoming Prime Minister, a group of Aboriginal people in the Redfern community, what's now known as the Block, got together and created an Aboriginal housing cooperative. This was another part of the stuff that we were doing in developing a thing called the Black Power movement in Redfern. But we formed a close association with some extraordinary young architecture students from Sydney University, Colin James and a few other people, who then assisted in developing an idea for what the Block might have been. And the Block originally was the Redfern Aboriginal Housing Project, and when Gough Whitlam became Prime Minister, they actually granted all of that area to the Aboriginal Housing Cooperative. I mean, in the many years since, the whole thing has been corrupted, but the original vision that was there was a very idealistic vision, and it was a fantastic vision. And the cooperation that occurred between a group of student architects from Sydney University and the Aboriginal community developed into a long-term relationship that was a really extraordinary and productive thing. They weren't out there in the streets fighting coppers like we were, but the work that they were doing within that little group of the Aboriginal Housing Cooperative there and helping the Aboriginal people develop ideas for an urban housing complex that was based on Aboriginal cultural values was quite an important and an extraordinary moment in history. And if you go down to Nicholson Street in Fitzroy today, you'll come across the Aboriginal Health Service. And that is another example of a cooperation between architects listening to what the needs of that community organisation were, and then developing a concept based on Aboriginal ideas about the use of space. And you walk into the Aboriginal Health Service there, and the ideas that you can immediately see are a combination of the architects' ideas, or architects putting into practice the ideas that had been expressed to them by the Aboriginal community people who running that organisation at the time. So there's, you know, activism isn't just getting out in the streets and kicking coppers or marching in the streets and things like that. There's a multitude of ways. And I'd include those school teachers who I taught at the University of Melbourne. You know, the work that they're quietly doing within, you know, they've infiltrated the education system on my behalf. I used to say to them, look, you mob of my little hand grenades. You're going to go out there into the world and you're going to explode with creativity and ideas, and you're going to inspire your students in the same way you reckon I've inspired you. Well, it'll be your turn soon. So there's a multitude of ways that you can express, you know, yourselves politically and make change, more importantly.
I think we might have time for just one more question.
Hi, my name's Michael. Back in 1978, we had a protest in Sydney, in Darlinghurst, and that was the Mardi Gras, the formation of Mardi Gras. Just this week, Sydney Mardi Gras decided not to include Malcolm Turnbull on the invite list for the next Mardi Gras parade because of his position on marriage equality. Elaine, you were saying that your organisation tries to shame the government when they do atrocious things. Jim, how do we shame the government?
You did say you were excited to lend your voice to marriage equality action in Australia.
I am. It's being loud and obnoxious and not letting it go. You know, pointing out that marriage, well, civil rights, you know, I think about my experience in the States, what happened in Ireland and what's happening here. You know, it's the court of law and it's the court of public opinion. And we have to hold our leaders accountable. You know, in the United States, the argument kept being, during the course of my case, well, the people voted for this marriage amendment that banned same-sex marriage. And our argument was always, well, it doesn't matter what the people voted because that doesn't make it constitutional, that doesn't make it right, that doesn't make it legal. And we continued to fight that, to say, you know, court of public opinion, people are on our side. Look at the polls, people want marriage equality, they say we deserve it. And the court now is saying we deserve it. Here in Australia, it's different for you. You know, public opinion is clearly on the side of marriage equality, and the High Court has ruled that marriage equality should be in place, and Parliament needs to do their job. The Court of Law has spoken, the Court of Public Opinion has spoken, and you just need to keep on them and keep embarrassing them that they are not moving forward the way that they should. And I can't think of how you do that other than using your voices, using venues like this, and bringing activists of all sorts to that fight. That's one of the things that I get frustrated about. And in the States, you know, we have all these groups that are fighting for civil rights, and all too often we fight each other. We don't fight together. And the big learning for me this week with the election is I can't be fighting just for LGBTQI rights. I have to fight for all rights. And for me, that means I have to use my voice, use my name recognition, everything I can do to fight for the rights of every single person in the United States. So for me, it's be loud, be obnoxious, protest, be in the streets, shut down public transportation, whatever it means. And I say that just because I'm thinking about the protests in the United States right now. But need to remind the politicians that they work for the people, and they need to represent the people, and they need to pay attention to the court of public opinion, especially here because the court of law has already said marriage equality should be in place. So not a great answer, I know, but it's purely comes down to that, being obnoxious, being loud, and not letting them stop you,
Amelia,
and working together.
Amelia, how would you respond to that question? Because in your speech you mentioned that young people are going to have to deal with the implications of decisions that we weren't included in. So how would you advocate?
Yeah. Just trying to think of some examples, because in the last couple of years, the Australian Youth Climate Coalition and SEED, Indigenous Youth Climate Network, we have been working with a lot of other environment groups and communities and people on the ground up in Queensland who've been fighting the proposed Adani Carmichael coal mine on Wangan and Jagalingou country, and a project that impacts not only the people's country up in Queensland but will impact Indigenous people and people all around the world if the coal from up there is dug up and burnt. And it's been an issue that, has sparked a lot of attention around the Great Barrier Reef and the impact that this project will have on the reef. And, this year, devastatingly, we've seen a lot of the reef, heavily impacted by coral bleaching and by heat, warmer waters coming through our east coast. But when it comes to kind of putting pressure on the government, and in particular using the elections as a moment to, try and put climate change and this particular, destructive project on the agenda, we've tried to come up with creative ways of doing that. And so it wasn't my idea, but there are young people out there who, do have a lot of creativity and want to do things differently and, learn from our elders, as Uncle Gary said, but also try and use new tactics as ways to have our message heard. And so a short story, when I was a bit younger, a couple of years ago, I got a call from my boss saying, "Hey Millie, I know it's 6:30 in the morning, but you need to get in the car, get down to Torquay." Who was it at the time? Kevin Rudd is going to be in Torquay, and we need you in the Nemo costume, and you need to get there and ask him how you're going to protect the Great Barrier Reef from, coal port expansions. And so I did exactly that. Next minute was dressed up in this bright orange Nemo costume, a mascot, I guess, for the Great Barrier Reef as a clownfish, and was pushed straight into the crowd of media and was right up against Kevin Rudd and said, "What are you going to do to protect my home? I'm Nemo." And, he had his 3-point answer, but it didn't really matter what he said at that time. It mattered that it was all over the front pages of, so many different newspapers. It was in the news. And we were able to do that with young people right across the country because we have a national grassroots network, and we hired out pretty much every single Nemo costume. And we did every morning when we got news from the media where Tony Abbott or Kevin Rudd were, we called up a young person, and so we were able to put that on the agenda. And then this year we did the same thing but with Dory and Nemo, and we managed to get promises from both Turnbull and Shorten that they weren't going to put public money towards the Adani Carmichael coal mine. We obviously need to keep up the pressure and keep them to those promises, but I think it's trying to come up with creative ways of getting the message out there and, doing it in a way that the media is going to love, and giving them no chance but to kind of, get right in front of them and make sure you get in the story.
I guess the value of a Finding Nemo costume is a good way to end tonight. That is all we have time for, very unfortunately, so please join me in thanking our incredible panel of movers and shakers and thinkers, Jim Obergefell, Elaine Pearson, Amelia Telford and Gary Foley.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.